Hi, my name is Christopher Bravery. I'm a consulting regulatory scientist at Advanced Biologicals. And today I'm going to talk to you about the first 22 ATMPs submitted to the EMA. And this is some research that I've done myself. And it looks at the period of 2001 to 2018. So it was published last year in Cell and Gene Therapy Insights. So as of June last year, there have actually been 25 ATMPs submitted. There's now been a few more. The cutoff date for this analysis is by the end of 2018, which means that there were 22 products submitted. The first one may not well be understood by many, well known by many people, because it was a product called Apligraf, which you may be familiar with, made by Organogenesis in Boston. And it was actually submitted by Novartis in 2001. And what's quite interesting about that is it actually precedes the definition of an advanced therapy medicinal product. That didn't come out until the Directive 2003/63 in 2003. And it was later amended and adapted to include a third category of tissue engineering products in Directive 2009/120. Apligraf, in my view, would be a somatic cell therapy in these definitions, not a tissue engineered product. So what were my aims? Well, the part of the analysis I'm going to talk about today was to ask the question, are we using scientific advice appropriately? And what is the impact on the quality of the dossier on the duration of the EMA procedure? And how do these both affect overall success rates? So there are of those 22, there are 17 submissions for which I could find information on scientific advice. For Apligraf, it was because it was too far in the past, that information wasn't there. For a couple of others, it was because the applicant had withdrawn the application early, and then the withdrawal EPAR doesn't actually include as much data as a full EPAR would do. So of those 17, actually all of them had asked for scientific advice. And that in itself was a slight surprise to me, or maybe not that much of a surprise, but a slight surprise in the bigger picture, because I was aware that many other products submitted to the EMA don't necessarily seek advice, although I'll show you that in a second. So the average number of advice procedures for each product overall was 2.6, which is fairly high. In fact, I think 5 scientific advices is really quite surprising, although I have now noticed that some of the more recent applicants of other product types like monoclonal antibodies have actually sought much more advice than was historically done. So if the product was approved, those products averaged 3.1 advices, and those that failed averaged 1.2 advices. So there is a slight hint that more advice might improve your success, but I'll untangle that a little bit more often. But it certainly supports the regulator's mantra of come often. The question is, was it useful? So I'm also going to include, to come back to this point a little bit, but just to give you a feel for what I mean about not everybody seeks scientific advice who submits a product to the EMA. Between 2000 and 2013, on average, it was only 42% of applications who actually sought advice, so less than half. If you go to a slightly older, shorter duration, so basically back in time, it was fewer, it was down to 37%. In another paper that looks at 2008 to 2012, you could see that year on year, there was actually an increase, and the highest was up to 70% of applicants in 2012. So apologies that this figure is a little bit complicated, but I'll walk you through it slowly. First of all, of course, the products are listed on the bottom. And those in red were failed applications, so they weren't approved. And those in green were approved, and those in orange were approved. The ones in orange were later withdrawn after approval. And actually, we need to add Zalmoxis into this category now. And that in itself is quite worrying, because that's a significant proportion of approved products that have been withdrawn from the market. And I have calculated the time for that, and it's around about 5 years. So in the center axis here is the 0 is the time, the date of the start of the main study. And by main study, I mean the study that provides the efficacy data for approval, be that a phase 2 or a phase 3. And then above that line is the duration before the start of that main study, and below that line is the duration after that main study. I guess I could have put it the other way around, but that's how I chose to do it. So as you can see, there are far more scientific advice procedures after the start of the main study on average overall than there are above the line before the main study. A couple of the products had prime, but again, you can see those prime interactions occurred after the start of the main study. Green confirms that it was a clinical question, because obviously one of the key questions you might ask here is about the design to make sure that it was suitable for approval. Those that are not filled in green, it means that I wasn't able to confirm the nature of the questions that were asked, because that isn't always clear in the EPAR. And then the shapes refer to a few other things that we won't worry about right now. And there's a few footnotes about the differences in the natures of the study. So it does seem a bit strange. The other thing you might have been going in for scientific advice to ask about before you started your main study are aspects of quality, because you want to do that main study with your pivotal, with your commercial process, or at least a commercial ready process. So you would have thought that people would be asking questions about quality as well, to make sure that their approach to that commercial process and its later validation during the pivotal would be sort of asked and reassured about. So I think we can say that we're not going early enough, perhaps. So this is one example, Hoffer, but there are a few papers that basically show the same thing. Analysis of all EMA submissions, or sometimes it's subsets like orphan products, consistently seems to show that there isn't a difference between the success rate, the proportion that are approved, of products that had asked for scientific advice or had not asked for scientific advice. So the actual act of asking for scientific advice doesn't seem to improve your chances of success. What does matter, and the message that the EMA pushes, is if you're not compliant with the advice, your chances of success is about half. Now that sort of makes sense, because obviously if you don't follow the advice given, it might be because you're taking the wrong route. But it doesn't necessarily mean that. As long as you explain why you didn't follow the advice and you can justify it, it shouldn't really matter. But apparently it does. So let's look at that for ATMPs. And what I've done as a measure here of how effective the scientific advice might have been, I suppose, is I've included the number of categories of major objection. And I'll explain that a bit in the minute. But these are areas where significant issues were raised. Products along the bottom, they're ordered in the most major objections on the left and the least on the right. The little square above each bar tells you how many scientific advices they had. The top of the bar tells you how many categories of major objection they had. And then the inserts that are squares or circles or diamonds refer to non-compliances from clinical, non-clinical quality. That's non-compliances to identified advice that was given in the scientific scientific advice and mentioned in the public assessment report. So if you look at the numbers on the top of the bars, above the top of the bars, then you can see there's a tendency for products on the right with fewer major objections to have a bigger number up there. They've had more scientific advice, and those on the left, but it's not exactly clear-cut. Then if you look at the numbers next to the indented symbols and where those are placed, you'll see that of the three worst products, if you like, and that's a horrible thing to say to them, the three products with the most issues on the left have a number of non-compliances. But there's also some non-compliances, although a lower number, on the right for those products that actually had rather few major objections and were successful. So that's interesting. And if we break that into numbers, we'll see that approved ATMP on average had half a non-compliance to the advice they were given, and failed ATMPs had 1.4 non-compliances on average to what they were given. But the ranges overlap a little bit. But if you look at the overall impact on success, those compliant with advice, 73% of those were approved. Those non-compliant with advice, well, 71% of those were approved. So in the bigger picture, it didn't alter the chances of success actually for ATMPs, unlike the broader picture for all medicines. Going back to these major objection categories, so that we can look a little bit about the impact on the duration of the market authorization, I initially tried to score these from the European public assessment reports. The issue with that is that the way that they're written isn't enormously consistent. In recent years, they're much clearer about the list of major objections that were raised. In the past, it could be a little bit more of a game to figure out what it was. So I cheated a little bit, or should I say I just borrowed the data set from Barkholt et al. And the reference is given in the top. That's a paper from CAT authors where they actually scored the ATMP's major objections, except for Luxturna, which I had to fill in myself. And it shows that, not sure why that happened, sorry. It shows that on average, ATMPs had 8 major objection categories. They might have had 10 questions, they might have had 20 questions, might have had 2, but it covered 8 categories of issue. Those that were approved had fewer, 6.4 with a range of 0 to 12, and those that failed had 11.8 with a range 10 to 18. Suggestive this might well be statistically significant, but I didn't try and calculate that. So what impact does this have on how long it takes you to get your market authorization approved? Well, I've got major objections on the x-axis, and I've got the total duration in days. That's from the start of the procedure to the issue of the license. And you'll see that there's a correlation coefficient for those products that got through to the end of the procedure. The ones in red here were withdrawn, so they're not part of that analysis of the R squared. You'll see there's a fairly good correlation between the number of major objections and how long it takes to get through the entire review process, with products such as Glybera sitting up at the top here, which went through 2 re-examinations and was a very difficult approval, shall we say, and was only approved under exceptional circumstances. Spherox is actually omitted from this analysis because there are reasons why it took so long. It was already on the market in Europe, and it had to reapply for a market authorization, which meant that it wasn't really ready and so on. Anyway, I think it's all understandable. You'll note that I've keyed this figure also to help you see whether the company was a small to medium-sized enterprise or a large company. And I think I think it becomes a little bit, you get a little bit of a hint that there's a difference there. When I put that into numbers, you'll see that on average, ATMPs take about 688 days to be approved. That's 1 year and 8 months. This is all excluding Spherox. SMEs take longer than large companies. And that is actually that's actually been observed for other types of product submitted to the EMA as well. And this is but even large companies are taking a little bit longer than the typical duration of an MAA. And I've provided numbers here that add all these figures up from the EMA's annual reports for the last 5 years, well, from 2018 to 14, because they break it all down, and they won't include things like re-examination. So another way of looking at this is to say, well, the first stage of the review process is actually takes 120 days, and then you're issued the first list of questions from the EMA. Unlike the FDA, you don't get rolling questions. They spend 120 days to come up with their first list of questions, and they send them to you. And they stop the clock, and you're given 3 months automatically. And to give you an idea of how 3 months looks on this figure, if you look at Emulgic, the diameter of that circle is 3 months. Any other circles that are bigger than that are longer than 3 months. And if you can't answer the questions in 3 months, you can ask for an extension. Under normal circumstances, they only normally allow you to extend that to 6 months. But with ATMPs, they are being more flexible, but it means that we've got some very large clock stop periods, sometimes for good reason, like Spheros. So you can see that those with more major objections are typically more towards the right, have bigger circles, and are taking longer to get through the procedure. But to be a little bit more positive, if we then reorder it in the order of submission, so that the most recent submission in my data set is on the left, then you'll see that there is a tendency for the bubbles to get smaller from right to left, suggestive that maybe the approval is occurring a little bit more quickly. But there's also more of a tendency to have big pharma involved in the more recent applications, and their sheer experience means that they should be able to help ensure that the duration of approval isn't so long. So overall, my summary is that ATMP applicants may not be using scientific advice as effectively as they could. Around 50% didn't actually ask for advice before starting their main study, but they asked for lots of advice afterwards, which seems counterintuitive. It also suggests they may not have been discussing their commercial process either, and the quality issues for these products are significant. The EMA's own data consistently shows that whether you have advice or not, it doesn't really make any difference to your chances of success. But if you deviate from their advice, it's likely to be a negative effect on your success rate. But I couldn't observe this for ATMPs, so it's a small number of products. Major objections, i.e. gaps and deficiencies in your dossier, just significantly lengthen the duration of the EMA procedure. So they aren't helpful. And it does, it should be an encouragement to provide a good dossier, because there are a couple of examples that show that you can get through the process very, very quickly. Indeed, of those ATMPs, several had asked for accelerated assessment, but hadn't managed to stay on that timetable. I don't have time to explain that. But Bluebird Bio did manage to do that recently with their Synteglo. And so it just shows that it is possible. Their overall duration was significantly shorter than most. And that's it. Thank you very much.